The horse Reins landed in Ruth Hawkins's hands like a sentence she was not ready to hear. Nathan Keating pressed them into her palms with a grip that was deliberate, final, the kind of grip a man uses when he has already made a decision and knows that no argument in the world will change it. His dark eyes held hers for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she saw everything she had been too afraid to name over the past 6 weeks. She saw the sacrifice behind his jaw. She saw the goodbye behind his stillness. She saw the love he had never once spoken aloud, pressing hard against the back of his teeth like something that wanted out but understood it could not be freed, not today, not here, not with the sound of boots on gravel echoing from the canyon ridge above them. "Ride north," Nathan said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had trained himself over a hard lifetime to feel everything and show almost nothing. "And do not wait for me." Ruth's fingers closed around the leather. The horse, a deep bay mare named Clover whom Nathan had fed by hand every single morning since they left Laramie, shifted her weight beneath the saddle as if she too understood the weight of the moment. Ruth stared at Nathan. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had buried a husband, survived a brutal Wyoming winter alone, and crossed 200 miles of open frontier with a wagon held together largely by her own determination. But this terrified her. Not the riders coming, not the guns, not even the blood she could see already drying on Nathan's left sleeve from where a bullet had kissed his forearm an hour ago in the canyon ambush. What terrified her was that she believed him. She believed he meant it. She believed that if she rode away right now, she would never see him again. Nathan, Ruth. He said her name like a period, like the end of a negotiation. His hand left the reins and moved briefly, unconsciously, to her jaw, one callous thumb tracing the edge of her cheekbone with a tenderness that was devastating in its brevity. Then it was gone. "There is a trading post at a settlement called Casper Creek, 3 miles due north. You will be safe there. Tell them Doyle sent you." And then he turned away from her and walked back toward the canyon mouth with nothing in his hands. But whatever quiet, iron certainty lived inside of him, and Ruth sat on Clover with the reins in her fists and felt the whole world narrow down to that single retreating figure, and the impossible question of whether loving someone meant doing what they asked or refusing to leave them to die alone. She had met Nathan Keating 43 days earlier, in the kind of circumstances that made for a very poor beginning. It was late October of 1878, and the town of Millhaven, Wyoming Territory, was the kind of place that had been built with ambition and was slowly surrendering it. The main street had 4 saloons and only 1 church, and the church lost worshippers to the saloons with reliable consistency every Sunday afternoon. The general store was run by a man named Petties who watered down his molasses and overcharged for salt. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man called Decker, had a reputation for enforcing laws selectively, with a preference for enforcing them against people who lacked political friends. Ruth had arrived in Millhaven on the morning stage from Cheyenne with a carpetbag, $42, and a letter of introduction to a man named Gerald Hawkins, who was supposed to be her husband. She had married Gerald Hawkins by proxy 6 months earlier, a legal arrangement conducted through correspondence and a lawyer in Cheyenne. She had done it practically, because she was 26 years old and the farm in Ohio had failed, and her options had narrowed considerably. Gerald's letters had been formal but not unkind. He had described himself as a cattle rancher in good standing, a man of 34 years with a house that needed a woman's presence and a willingness to provide a stable life. What she found when the stage pulled up was considerably different. Gerald Hawkins was not on the platform. What was on the platform was his foreman, a wiry man named Cass, who looked at Ruth with something uncomfortably close to pity, and told her that Gerald had been killed 3 weeks prior in a dispute over water rights with a neighboring ranch. The dispute had been settled, Cass said carefully, in the way such disputes sometimes were settled out here, which meant with firearms and without lawyers. Ruth stood on the platform with her carpetbag and absorbed this. She was not, strictly speaking, a widow in the traditional sense, since she had never actually met Gerald Hawkins alive. But she was legally his widow, which meant she was entitled to whatever he had left behind. Cass drove her out to the ranch, which turned out to be a modest property with a solid house, 80 head of cattle, and a mortgage that was 2 months behind. He also told her, haltingly, that the man who had shot Gerald, a rancher named Corbin Voss, was not a man who considered legal ownership a particularly binding constraint on his ambitions. "He has been wanting this land for 3 years, Cass said. "He wanted it from Gerald. He will want it from you." Ruth thanked Cass, unpacked her carpetbag, and made herself a cup of coffee from the supplies in Gerald's kitchen. Then she sat at the kitchen table and thought carefully about her situation. She was alone. She was in a territory she did not know, with a ranch she did not know how to run, married to a dead stranger, and apparently already targeted by a powerful and violent neighbor. She had $42, a proxy marriage certificate, and a stubbornness that people had been commenting on since she was approximately 7 years old. She decided she was not leaving. She spent the next 2 weeks learning everything she could about the cattle operation from Cass, who stayed on despite the uncertain pay situation because he was a loyal man, and because he had genuinely liked Gerald. She filed the appropriate legal documents at the land office in Millhaven to confirm her ownership of the Hawkins property. She paid the mortgage arrears with $30 of her $42, which left her frighteningly thin on resources but legally secure. And then Corbin Voss came to call. He arrived with 2 men and arrived formally, which she supposed was its own kind of warning. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from genuine ease, but from a long history of getting what you wanted through whatever means presented themselves. He took off his hat when he came inside, which was politeness, and then he offered her half of what the land was worth for an immediate sale, which was an insult wearing politeness's clothing. Ruth declined. Voss put his hat back on. His eyes, which were pale gray and not unkind in a superficial way, moved around the room in a manner that she understood was meant to communicate his assessment of her vulnerability. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, "I am going to be honest with you. This is not a place for a woman alone. This is difficult country, and it will be harder for you than you can presently imagine." "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Voss," Ruth said. "Good afternoon." He left. His 2 men glanced at each other in a way she caught, and she understood that this was not over. It was the following evening that Nathan Keating walked into her life. He arrived on foot, which was unusual, leading a limping horse by the bridle through the early evening dusk, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who has accepted that things are going at whatever pace they are going, and not a moment faster. Ruth saw him from the kitchen window and went to the porch with the shotgun she had found in Gerald's bedroom, because a strange man on foot in failing light was not something to meet unarmed. He stopped at the edge of the yard. He was tall, somewhere in the middle of his 30s, with a lean build and dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been weathered by sustained outdoor living into something angular and quietly striking. He wore a battered gray coat, trail-worn trousers, and had a Colt revolver holstered at his hip, which she noted, and he made no attempt to obscure or minimize. "I am not here for trouble," he said. His voice carried easily across the yard without being raised. "My horse threw a shoe and pulled up lame on the east road. I saw the light. I am asking if there is a place to sleep in a barn and whether you might have any feed to spare. I will pay for both." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. He did not fidget. He did not try to be charming. He simply stood and waited for her answer with the patience of someone who understood that her caution was reasonable and was not going to penalize her for it. "What is your name?" she said. "Nathan Keating." "Where are you coming from, Mr. Keating?" "South," he said. "I'm heading to Montana Territory." "What is in Montana?" A brief pause. "A friend who owes me money and has been promising to pay it for 2 years." Despite everything, Ruth almost smiled. "The barn is there," she said, gesturing. "There is hay. The feed is in the bin on the east wall. I will bring you something to eat." "You do not have to. I am not doing it because I have to," she said, and went inside to heat the stew. She brought it out to the barn along with bread and a tin cup of coffee, and found him examining his horse's hoof with the focused, careful attention of a man who was genuinely concerned rather than merely performing concern. The horse was a bay mare, she noted. Calm animal, well cared for. He thanked her for the food with genuine brevity, ate it without complaint, and did not try to extend the conversation beyond what was comfortable. When she went back inside, she found herself, with a mild sense of surprise, not at all worried about having a strange man in her barn. There had been something about him, a quality she did not have a clean word for, a kind of quietness that was not absence but presence, a stillness that was not empty but full. She slept without incident. In the morning he came to the house to return the pot and the cup. His horse, he said, would need another day of rest at minimum. He offered to work for the day in exchange for the use of the barn. "What kind of work can you do?" Ruth asked. "Most kinds," he said. She gave him the fence line on the north pasture that Cass had been meaning to get to for 2 weeks. He spent the day on it with post-hole diggers and wire, and a quiet, methodical efficiency that she watched from time to time through the kitchen window with the specific appreciation of someone who had grown up around practical labor and knew the difference between a man who worked and a man who performed working. When the fence was done, he found 2 other things that wanted doing and did those as well, unprompted. That evening she made a fuller supper and invited him to the kitchen table, because it seemed rude not to. Over the meal, which was venison stew and cornbread, they talked. Carefully, as 2 strangers of good sense talk when they are feeling each other out, with the particular conversational choreography of the frontier where personal questions are not asked directly, but are instead arrived at from the side over time, through the accumulation of incidental detail. She told him about Gerald and the proxy marriage with a matter-of-fact quality that she suspected concealed more grief than she had processed, not for Gerald specifically, whom she had not known, but for the situation, for the strangeness of mourning a hope rather than a person. He listened without trying to fix or interpret. She told him about Corbin Voss. Something in Nathan's expression changed at that name, not dramatically. His face was not a face that made dramatic changes, but something behind his eyes shifted, a very slight alteration in a very controlled landscape, and she noticed it because she was already, without quite realizing it, paying close attention to him. "You know that name," she said, a silence. "Then, I know of him." "In what context?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "He is not a man who accepts no for an answer," Nathan said finally. "He has a long history of acquiring what he wants, not always through legal means." "I gathered that," Ruth said. "What do you know specifically?" He looked at her directly for the first time since sitting down, and she felt the quality of that gaze. It was the gaze of someone deciding something. "3 years ago," he said, "there was a man named Aldous Perry. He had a small silver claim in the hills east of here. Voss wanted it. Perry refused to sell. Perry died in what was officially ruled an accident. His claim transferred to Voss 6 weeks later." Ruth absorbed this. "That is a serious accusation." "It is a serious fact," Nathan said quietly. She looked at him. "How do you know this?" Another pause, longer this time. "I was in the area," he said, and did not elaborate further. She did not press him. It was, she understood instinctively, a place where pressing would close something rather than open it. She filed it and let it rest. He stayed a second day, and then a third, because Cass developed a fever and there was more work than Ruth could manage alone, and Nathan did it without being asked, and with a competence that was both impressive and quietly restoring. She did not examine too closely her own feelings about his presence, about the specific quality of the silence when he was somewhere on the property, a silence that felt occupied rather than empty. On the 4th night there was trouble. She woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of her cattle moving. Not the random shifting of animals at night, but the purposeful, disturbed movement of a herd being pushed somewhere against its will. She was out of bed, and to the window quickly enough to see the torchlight at the east fence line. 3 men on horseback moving her cattle toward a gap they had made in the fence that Nathan had repaired. She had the shotgun in her hands and was pulling on her boots when Nathan appeared in the hallway. He had heard it too, apparently from the barn. He was fully dressed and his hand was on his Colt. "Stay here," he said. "Absolutely not," she said. He looked at her for 1 second, then nodded, accepting this with a speed that suggested he had correctly assessed that arguing would waste valuable time. They went out together. What happened next was not a gunfight, exactly. Nathan moved with a particular quiet purposefulness that was very effective at making armed men uncertain. He got within speaking distance of 2 of the riders before they were fully aware of him, and what he said to them was short and said in a voice so low and level that Ruth could not hear the words from her position, only the tone, which was the tone of a man explaining a mathematical certainty. The 2 riders left. The third, who had been farther into the herd, saw his partners leaving and followed. Ruth stood in the dark and watched Nathan walk back across the yard toward her. "What did you say to them?" she asked. "That I knew their names," Nathan said, "and that I would say them clearly to the right people if anything further happened tonight." "Do you know their names?" "I do now," he said. "I recognized 2 of them from Voss's outfit." She stared at him. "You have been here 4 days, and you already know the men in Voss's outfit." He said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was Nathan's way of confirming something without having to actively claim it. "Nathan Keating," she said. "Who exactly are you?" He met her eyes in the dark. The torch the rustlers had dropped was still burning on the ground 20 yards away, and its light touched the planes of his face with gold. "Someone with a complicated history," he said, and then, almost as if the word surprised him by existing, "someone who is reconsidering the direction of his travel." He did not go to Montana. He stayed, first for practical reasons, then for reasons neither of them named. Cass recovered from his fever and returned to work, and so there was less practical justification for Nathan's presence on a daily basis. And yet his presence remained, settling into the rhythm of the ranch with a naturalness that might have alarmed Ruth if she had been paying less attention to it or more attention to it. But she was paying exactly the right amount of attention to notice that it felt correct in the way that things feel correct when they are in the right place. They worked together during the days. They ate supper together most evenings. They talked about everything except the things that mattered most, which was itself a kind of intimacy, the construction of a shared world of practical knowledge and daily observation, from which the larger emotional architecture could eventually be inferred. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the son of a man who had strong ideas about obligation and very little patience for ambiguity. She learned that he had done things in his 20s that he did not detail, but that had taken him to places and situations that had required a particular kind of adaptation. She learned that he had been working for the past 2 years as a kind of private investigator, a phrase that was not yet commonly in use, but was the closest approximation, tracking stolen cattle and missing goods and men who had disappeared in legally ambiguous circumstances across Wyoming and Colorado and Nebraska. She did not learn everything. There were rooms in him, she could tell, that were dark and closed, not because he was deceptive by nature, but because he had spent a very long time making sure that the number of people who could reach him was small, and the number of ways he could be hurt was smaller still. She was not offended by this. She had her own closed rooms. What she had was a growing, insistent awareness of him that had nothing to do with practicality, and everything to do with the specific way he handed her things, tools and cups, and the occasional folded piece of paper with a note about cattle count, with a care for her hands that he was entirely unconscious of. The way he stopped whatever he was doing when she spoke and gave her his full attention without performance. The way he laughed, which was infrequent and quiet and entirely genuine, a low, brief sound that only appeared when something actually struck him as funny, and that, when it did appear, struck her somewhere just below the sternum with a force entirely disproportionate to its size. 3 weeks into his stay, Corbin Voss came back. This time he came with a lawyer from Cheyenne, which was a more sophisticated approach and therefore more concerning. The lawyer's name was Farwell, and he had the smooth, careful manner of a man who had spent years being persuasive in situations where persuasion served as the genteel face of coercion. He presented Ruth with a document, an offer to purchase the Hawkins property at a price that was slightly more than half its market value, framed with a number of legal subclauses that, when she read them carefully, amounted to an implicit suggestion that her title to the property was vulnerable to challenge. "My title is not vulnerable," Ruth said, setting the document on the kitchen table. "I have the proxy marriage certificate, the legal filing with the land office, and the paid mortgage receipt. Everything is in order. In the territory," Lawyer Farwell said, with a kind of precision, "legal title and practical security are not always the same thing." "And is that a legal observation or a threat?" Ruth asked. Voss, who had been quiet until this point, spoke from the doorway where Nathan was standing with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness that Ruth had come to recognize as Nathan's version of heightened alertness. "It is a friendly observation," Voss said, "from a man who has experience in this territory and wishes you no difficulty." "Mr. Voss," Nathan said, conversationally, "I believe you were acquainted with a man named Aldous Perry some years back." The silence that followed this was the most interesting silence Ruth had ever witnessed. It was a silence with a shape, a specific geometry of recognition and calculation and barely controlled alarm, all of it passing across Corbin Voss's face in a span of perhaps 4 seconds before his expression reset to something neutral and controlled. "I did not know Perry well," Voss said. "Well enough," Nathan said, pleasantly. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Ruth. Something in his assessment of the situation had clearly shifted. "We will be in touch," he said, and left. That evening, sitting on the porch in the October cold with coffee cups in their hands, Ruth looked at Nathan and said, "The mention of Perry's name did that. What exactly do you know about Perry's death?" He was quiet for a while. The night was clear and enormous over them, the Wyoming sky in late autumn having a kind of cosmic indifference that was both humbling and oddly comforting. "I know enough," he said. "I was in the area when Perry died. Not by accident. I had been hired by a man in Denver to look into Voss's operation. There had been concerns raised about the pattern of acquisitions. I was gathering evidence. I did not gather it fast enough to help Perry. That has been something I have carried." He paused. "I have documentation, letters, ledger copies that were shared with me by someone inside Voss's organization who is no longer alive. Enough to bring a serious legal case against Voss for the Perry matter, but it requires the right legal authority and a certain amount of physical safety to do it properly." Ruth looked at him. "And why have you not done this before now?" "Because the man I was working for in Denver died of natural causes 18 months ago, before we could act, and because Voss has considerable influence over the local legal apparatus. Sheriff Decker is his man. The territorial judge who sits in Laramie is more complicated but still susceptible. It has required finding the right angle. And now—" He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight from the kitchen window his face had the quality of a man deciding whether to be fully honest. "And now," he said, "I have more reason than I had before to see it through." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complicated that she chose not to examine immediately. "What reason?" He said nothing, but he did not look away. That night she lay awake for 2 hours thinking about Nathan Keating, not as a practical question, but as a much more personal one. And what she concluded, with the directness that was native to her character, was that she was in serious danger of being in love with him. She further concluded that this was not a circumstance she had sought or planned, but that it was real, and that Ruth Hawkins had never in her life run from something real. The next 2 weeks proceeded with the surface calm of hard work and daily life, and the subterranean electricity of two people who are aware of each other with every peripheral nerve. Nathan began writing letters, sent through an attorney he trusted in Laramie rather than through the Millhaven Post, which Voss had almost certainly compromised. He was building the legal case against Voss methodically, carefully, with the particular patience of a man who had learned at some cost that rushing an important thing was a reliable way to destroy it. Voss made 2 more approaches, both indirect, one through an intermediary who offered Ruth a better price for the cattle alone, and one through Sheriff Decker who came out to the ranch with a vague suggestion about a disputed property line that Ruth met with the relevant legal documents laid out on the kitchen table before Decker had finished his sentence. Neither approach succeeded. Voss was intelligent enough to know that legal confrontations were tricky when the opposing party had their documentation correct, and he was waiting, she suspected, for a different kind of opportunity. She was right about that. On a Friday evening in mid-November, Cass came riding in hard from the south fence with the news that there were riders on the ridge east of the canyon, 3 of them, watching the property. By morning there were 5 and they were camped, not doing anything. Just there, visible, watching. It was a pressure tactic. It was meant to make her feel surrounded and monitored and unsafe, to erode her nerve over time. It was actually quite effective as a psychological instrument, and Ruth found herself aware of it working on the edges of her composure in ways she resented. Nathan looked at the riders through Gerald's old field glass from the barn roof on a Sunday morning and was very quiet for a long time. 3 of those men are not Voss's regular outfit, he said, coming down. They are professionals, hired from outside. What does that mean? It means Voss is escalating. He is moving from local pressure to something more serious. Nathan set the field glass down. There is a federal marshal in Laramie, a man named Cutter. He is one of 3 or 4 men in this territory who are genuinely outside Voss's reach. If I can get the documentation to Cutter in person, along with a formal written statement, it creates a legal mechanism that is large enough to restrain Voss while the case moves forward. But you would have to go to Laramie, Ruth said. Yes. Which would mean leaving. Yes. They looked at each other. Take Cass, Ruth said. Cass needs to stay here. And Cass is not the right presence in a meeting with a federal officer. He paused. I was thinking both of us could go. I am not abandoning the ranch. I know, he said quietly. But Ruth, I am concerned about your safety here without. He stopped himself. The habit of understatement was very strong in him, but what he had almost said, she understood, was without me. I will not be pushed off this land, she said. Not by Corbin Voss and not by hired men on a ridge. If you need to go to Laramie, then go. I will be fine. He looked at her with something in his eyes that she could not entirely interpret, that mix of admiration and fear that men experience when they encounter a woman whose courage is entirely real rather than performed. All right, he said. I will go quickly. 4 days. She nodded. He left the next morning. The 4 days were difficult. Not in any dramatic way. Nothing overt happened. The riders stayed on the ridge watching. Cass was there. She worked and slept and told herself she was not counting the days. She was counting the days. Nathan returned on the evening of the 4th day, and she was in the yard when he rode in, and they looked at each other across the 50 feet of hard dirt between them with a frankness that neither of them had quite permitted themselves before, and Ruth felt something settle in her chest like a long-held breath releasing. Marshal Cutter is taking it seriously, Nathan said, when he reached her. He is sending deputies to collect the documentation I left with the attorney. He wants a formal statement from me in Laramie within 10 days, and he is sending a letter to Voss informing him that he is under federal scrutiny. Will that stop Voss? It will slow him, and it may panic him, which is either better or worse, depending on what he decides to do. As it turned out, it was worse. The panic came 6 days later, at night, in the form of 2 men who were not Voss's regular hands, and who came to the ranch house with the specific intention not of intimidating Ruth, but of removing the person who was building the legal case against Voss. Nathan. Ruth heard it. She was awake, reading by lamplight, when she heard the horses in the yard, and she was fast enough and alert enough to put out the lamp and go to the window before the door was tried. She saw the two men dismount with a purposefulness that was not the purposefulness of people coming to talk. She went to the back of the house and went out the rear door and crossed to the barn, where Nathan slept. She got to him 20 seconds before the men reached the barn door. In the confusion and darkness and physical urgency of what followed, she did not have time to be frightened, which was perhaps the reason she performed adequately. Nathan, who came awake instantly and silently, managed the situation with a competence that she found both impressive and troubling, disarming one man and restraining both within a short span of time with a physical efficiency that spoke of practiced experience. The two men, when the lamp was lit and they could be seen, were strangers, not local, professional as he had assessed earlier. They were alive. Nathan had been extremely precise about that. He tied them and sent Cass to get Sheriff Decker, who came out at dawn with an expression of a man caught between his employer's interests and the hard reality of two restrained men who had made the mistake of being apprehended rather than successful. Decker took them in. Nathan rode into Millhaven that afternoon and sent word ahead to Marshal Cutter's office in Laramie about the incident. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, Nathan said, "He is going to try something more direct and more dangerous. The federal involvement has backed him into a corner and he is going to act on it before Cutter's deputies arrive." "When do the deputies arrive?" 8 days. Possibly 9. "Can we hold for 9 days?" He looked at the table, then at her, and she saw in his expression something she had not seen before, a crack in the careful containment, a slippage of something controlled that was really fear, not for himself, she realized, but for her. "Nathan," she said. "I should not have stayed," he said. "I should not have let this become." He stopped. "Let what become what?" she said, and her voice was quiet, but there was steel under it. He looked at her directly, and in his eyes was everything he had not said, all the feeling that had been accumulating since that first night in the barn when he had eaten her stew, and something in him had recognized something in her with the involuntary certainty of a compass finding north. "I should not have let you become someone whose safety I cannot guarantee," he said. "That was selfish of me." "Nathan Keating," Ruth said, slowly and with precision, "I am a grown woman who makes her own decisions. You did not let me do anything. I chose to let you stay. I chose to trust you. I made those choices and they are mine, and if you believe that my feelings in this situation are somehow your fault or your responsibility, you are mistaken." He was very still. "I know what I feel," she said, "and I suspect you know what you feel. And I am not going to pretend otherwise because circumstances are difficult, because circumstances in this territory are always difficult, and if we wait for them to become simple, we will wait forever." The silence stretched between them, taut and alive. And then Nathan Keating, who was a man of very few uncalculated actions, did something that was entirely uncalculated. He reached across the table and took her hand, both of them, covering them with his in a way that was not tentative and not aggressive but simply certain, the gesture of a man who has made a decision and is standing behind it. "I have not known how to say this properly," he said. "I have not had a great deal of practice with things I want to say properly." "Then say it improperly," Ruth said. He looked at her for a moment. And then, quietly and without flourish, Nathan Keating told Ruth Hawkins that he loved her. He said it simply as a statement of fact, which was the most devastating possible way he could have said it because it had the quality of something true rather than something constructed. She squeezed his hands. "I love you," she said, "and now that we have established that, perhaps we could discuss how to survive the next 9 days." He laughed. That quiet, brief, entirely genuine laugh that did something irreversible to her equilibrium. "Yes," he said, "let us do that." They planned carefully. Nathan sent Cass to stay at a neighbor's property 2 miles west, both to protect Cass and to avoid having him caught in whatever was coming. He reinforced the house shutters with extra bar wood. He moved additional ammunition to 3 locations in the house. He wrote a long, detailed letter to Marshal Cutter, sealed it, and gave it to Ruth to carry in her coat at all times, explaining that if anything happened to him, this letter contained everything Cutter needed to prosecute Voss. And he told her, on the second day of their 9-day wait, that there was a document she did not yet know about, a ledger page that proved not only the Perry murder, but that Voss had bribed 3 county officials in the past 5 years to obtain favorable land rulings. This document was in a lockbox in Laramie with the attorney, and it was the most critical piece of the case. "If Voss gets this from me," Nathan said, "all of it goes away. The case, the prosecution, Perry's justice. Why would he get it from you? You just said it is in Laramie." "He does not know that," Nathan said. "He believes I am carrying it, and he believes correctly that I am the primary witness who can authenticate it and explain its chain of custody to a federal court." Ruth understood. "Which is why removing you specifically is his primary objective." "Yes." "And protecting you," she said carefully, "is therefore the same as protecting the case." "Yes." She did not find this romantic. She found it logical, and she accepted it, but she made a private note that, after all of this was over, she did not want Nathan Keating to refer to himself primarily as instrumental to a legal case ever again. He was more than the sum of what he was useful for. She intended to make sure he understood this. The 7 remaining days passed with a heightened alertness that was exhausting in the way that sustained vigilance is exhausting, not dramatic but grinding, the body running on an elevated baseline of readiness that depleted slowly and continuously. They slept in shifts. They talked when not watching, with the quality of people who are aware that conversation may be finite and therefore treat each exchange as valuable. They talked about Ohio and Missouri, and what they each had imagined for their lives as children. Nathan with a careful honesty about a childhood that had been structured and demanding in a way that had built capability, but at a certain cost. Ruth with her characteristic directness, about a family that had been warm but not prosperous, and a young womanhood that had involved a great deal of practical creativity in the face of limited resources. On the 6th night, he kissed her for the first time. It happened on the porch at 2 in the morning, when she had come out with coffee to spell him on watch, and he had turned to take the cup, and their hands had overlapped on it, and they had been very close in the dark, and neither of them had moved back. The kiss was quiet and serious, the way he was, and it lasted a moment and then another, and when it ended she rested her forehead against his jaw and felt his hand move to the back of her neck with that careful, deliberate tenderness that was the most Nathan thing she could imagine. "After this," he said, against her hair. "After all of this is finished." "Yes," she said. "There are things I want," he said, "that I have not let myself want in a long time." "Tell me." "A place that is mine," he said. "Legitimately mine, not a barn or a hotel room, a table, someone across the table." He paused. "Children, perhaps, if that is something." "Yes," she said, clearly and without ambiguity. He held her tighter for a moment, and she felt in that brief tightening the depth of what he had been carrying alone for a long time, the weight of a self-sufficiency that had been necessary, and was now, in the presence of something he had not expected to find, revealed as exhausting. On the 7th day, the riders came down from the ridge. There were 7 of them, which was more than she had expected and more than Nathan had expected. They came in the late morning, when the light was clear and the visibility was good, which she supposed was meant to demonstrate that they were not being secretive about this, that Voss had decided the legal consequences were less immediate than the threat Nathan represented, and was willing to be brazen about it. Nathan was on the roof when they came over the north rise. He came down fast and came inside and stood in the center of the kitchen and made a calculation she could see him making, his eyes moving to the shuttered windows, to the door, to her face. "There are too many," he said. "We have the house," she said. "Ruth." He said her name in a specific way, the way that meant he was going to say something important. Two of those men are shooters, professional. This is not about intimidation anymore. This is Voss choosing the legal risk over the alternative. She understood the alternative. Then we do not let them get to the house, she said. We cannot hold 7. Then we send for help. There is no time. The riders had stopped about 300 yards out and appeared to be conferring. She had perhaps 5 minutes, maybe fewer. Nathan was watching her with the expression of a man who is solving something under pressure and has just arrived at an answer he does not like. There is another option, he said. Tell me. Casper Creek, he said. The trading post to the north. It is 3 miles. It is a Medes and American settlement. The Doyle family runs it. Garrett Doyle is a man of considerable local respect, and he has no love for Voss. He also has sons who are capable men. He paused. If you rode north now before they spread out to cover the flanks, you could get through. You could get Doyle and his people and come back. And you, she said, I can hold the house long enough. I know this property. I have the angles. Against 7. Against 7 who are not expecting a problem. Nathan, Ruth, he stopped. His expression was doing something she had never seen it do, all the contained depth coming to the surface at once, the whole landscape of feeling that he usually showed only in fragments, visible fully and without restraint for one raw moment. I need you to be safe. Whatever else is true about today, I need you to be safe. And I need you to be alive, she said. I will be. You cannot promise that. No, he said, but I can promise that I will try with everything I have. And I can promise that what I am trying to preserve by trying is not only my life. He held her gaze. It is the life after this. The one we talked about, the table and someone across it. She stared at him. Her chest was doing something very painful. He went to the door and opened it and went to the barn and came back leading Clover. He had saddled her in approximately 2 minutes, which was fast even for a man with his skill. He led her around to the south side of the house, out of the sightlines of the riders. He pressed the reins into her hands. The leather was warm from his grip. She looked down at it and then up at him. Ride north, he said. His voice was low and even, and it cost him enormously to keep it that way. And do not wait for me. She looked at him for 3 seconds. She counted them. 3 seconds in which she memorized his face in the morning light, the strong line of his jaw, the darkness of his eyes, the small scar above his left brow from some history she had not yet heard. 3 seconds in which she understood that this was love. This was what it looked like when it was real. Not the comfortable and the convenient, but the hard-edged and terrifying willingness to do what was necessary for the other person, even when what was necessary split you open. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. Nathan Keating, she said from the saddle, you had better be there when I come back. Something crossed his face, something that was almost a smile and was more than a smile because it was also grief and also certainty and also love in its most direct form. I will do my very best, he said. She rode. She went south first, behind the house, using the terrain to stay below the line of sight of the riders, and then angled west and then north, pushing Clover hard across the open ground while her heart made a sound in her chest like a door closing. She did not look back. She had decided, with the fierce practicality that was her nature, that looking back would cost her speed and resolve, and she could not afford either loss. The 3 miles to Casper Creek took her 14 minutes. The trading post was a low, solid building surrounded by a cluster of outbuildings, a smithy, a storehouse, a corral. There were 2 wagons in the yard and a group of men she did not know who turned to look at her as she rode in hard and pulled Clover to a stop in a way that made her intentions unmistakable. Doyle, she said to the nearest man. Where is Garrett Doyle? The man called into the building. A figure appeared in the doorway. A broad, weathered man of perhaps 55 with a mixed Medes and American background written in his face, and a quality of presence that was immediately authoritative. He came forward and looked at her with the focused assessment of a man who reads situations quickly. Doyle, she said. Yes. Nathan Keating sent me. He said to tell you Doyle sent me. Garrett Doyle's expression changed. Nathan is in trouble. 7 armed men at the Hawkins ranch south of here, professional shooters hired by Corbin Voss. Nathan is holding the house. Doyle turned to the men in the yard. He was already giving orders before he had finished turning. She watched 5 men begin moving with the particular efficient speed of people who have done this kind of thing before and who have a clear reference point for what it requires. 2 of the men were his sons, she gathered. 3 were men of the settlement who were, apparently, willing to ride for someone who had earned Doyle's endorsement. "Can you ride back?" Doyle asked her. "Yes," she said. She had not gotten off Clover. "Then ride close on my left," he said, and went to his own horse. The ride back south was nothing like the ride north. It was loud in a way that was intentional, 7 horses with the kind of purposeful thunder that announces itself as a force that has committed to an arrival. Ruth rode at Doyle's left, and she was aware of her heartbeat in a way she normally was not, aware of it as the monitor of something she very much wanted to continue having. They heard the gunshots at a mile out. Not many, 4 or 5, then silence. She pressed Clover harder. The ranch came over the rise ahead of them, and she was scanning the yard before they cleared the last rise, scanning for Nathan, for what the situation was, for the specific shape of what she was going to find. What she found was this. 2 of Voss's riders were down in the yard, not moving. One was sitting against the barn wall with his arm pressed to his shoulder. The other 4, she learned later, had retreated before the arrival of Doyle's party could reach them, having apparently encountered more resistance than expected from a single man in a fortified house. And Nathan was on the porch. He was standing upright, which was the first thing she needed to see, and the thing she would later remember as one of the most powerfully affecting sights of her life. His tall figure in the morning light, upright and present and alive, and he was watching her come in across the yard with an expression that had finally given up on containment entirely. She was off Clover before the horse had fully stopped, and she was across the yard without being fully aware of crossing it, and then his arms were around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood there in the middle of the yard with Doyle's party arriving around them, and the dust still settling, and the entire complicated, terrifying, necessary sequence of the morning, resolving itself into the single simple fact of him being alive and her being there. "You came back," he said, into her hair. It was not accusatory, it was something else entirely. "You told me not to wait," she said. "You did not say not to come back." She felt him exhale against her, a long, slow release of everything he had been holding since he pressed those reins into her hands. "No," he said. "I did not say that." Garrett Doyle proved to be a man of considerable practical competence. He organized the situation with efficiency, his 2 sons securing the injured man against the barn and seeing to the 2 who were down, neither of whom was dead but both of whom were seriously incapacitated. A rider was dispatched immediately to the federal marshal's office in Laramie with a detailed account of the attack, signed by Doyle, by Ruth, and by Nathan, with a request for immediate response. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, where Ruth cleaned the graze on his forearm from the canyon ambush, which turned out to be one of 2 injuries, the other being a cut across his shoulder blade from a near miss that he had not mentioned until she found it while she was checking him over with the thoroughness of a woman who was not taking his word for his own condition. "You did not tell me about this one," she said, cleaning it. "It seemed like a minor detail at the time," he said. "It is not a minor detail," she said. "Nothing about your body is a minor detail to me." He was quiet for a moment. "I need to practice saying things," he said, "the things that matter. I have spent a long time editing them out." "Yes," she said, "you do, and we have time for that." She paused. "We are going to have a great deal of time." The federal deputies arrived from Laramie 2 days later, not the original 8 or 9 days from the schedule, but accelerated by the attack and Doyle's report, which had been taken with the seriousness it warranted. Marshal Cutter himself arrived the day after, a composed, methodical man who interviewed Nathan, Ruth, Doyle, and the injured surviving attacker with careful thoroughness. The case against Corbin Voss moved forward with a speed that was unusual for territorial justice, but that was the result of several factors working together. The quality of Nathan's documentation, the Aldous Perry evidence that had been waiting nearly 3 years for the right moment, the witnesses to the attack on the Hawkins property, and the federal interest in demonstrating that organized land fraud and hired violence were not matters that territorial authority would ignore. Voss was arrested in Millhaven on a cold November morning. The arrest was conducted by Cutter's deputies, and Sheriff Decker, confronted with the end of Voss's protection, made the calculation that cooperation with federal authority was preferable to continued loyalty to a man in custody, and provided additional information that added 2 further counts to the charges against Voss. Nathan testified before the federal court in Laramie in late December, making the journey with Ruth beside him, because she had stated simply that she was going, and there had been no sensible argument against it. He testified for 2 days with a clarity and precision that Cutter told him afterward was the most thorough documented account he had received in 11 years of law work. Voss was convicted in February of 1879 on charges that included fraud, extortion, and complicity in the death of Aldous Perry. He was sentenced to 15 years at the federal penitentiary in Illinois, which would not bring Perry back and which was insufficient for the measure of what he had done, but which was real, which was legal record, which was justice in the form that the apparatus of law in that year and place could generate. Ruth stood outside the courthouse in Laramie on the day the verdict came in the February cold, and Nathan stood beside her, and they were quiet for a moment with the enormity of the thing that had been finished. "Perry," Nathan said, "I thought about him through all of it." "I know," Ruth said. "He knows wherever he is." Nathan was quiet. He was not a sentimental man by habit, but he was a genuine one, and the weight of 3 years of carrying the knowledge of Perry's death and the evidence of Voss's guilt, waiting for the moment when it could be used, was something she understood had cost him. She slipped her hand into his and held it, and he held back. "What do you want to do now?" He said. "Go home," Ruth said. "The ranch. There is spring work to plan, and I have been away long enough." "And after that," he said. There was something in his voice that made her look at him. He was looking at her with a seriousness that was not anxious but that was deliberate, the expression of a man who is about to make a statement he means entirely. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew something that she recognized after a moment as a ring. A simple ring, gold, not elaborate, the kind of thing a man might carry for some days before finding the right moment. "I have been doing this poorly," he said. "I am aware of that. In a different kind of story I would have done this in a better setting and earlier and with more words prepared. But I am going to do it now, in February, outside a courthouse in Laramie, because I have learned in the past few months that waiting for perfect circumstances is a way of not living." Ruth looked at the ring and then at him. "Ruth Hawkins," Nathan said, "will you marry me, properly this time, not by proxy, actually in person with me standing there and meaning it?" She laughed, and it was the laugh of a woman who is entirely happy in a way she had not expected to be, a full and real laugh that came out into the cold air and rose. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I have been in love with you since you fixed my fence line." "The fence was very good work," he said, and there was the quiet laugh, the real one, and she loved it with a specificity and a certainty that felt like the most stable thing she had ever stood on. He put the ring on her finger and then he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the full force of everything she felt, which was considerable, and they were standing in the street in Laramie doing this in February, which was cold and public and entirely undignified, and she did not care about either of those things at all. They were married in April of 1879 in Millhaven, at the church that competed unsuccessfully with the saloons. Garrett Doyle came with his family. Cass came, wearing a coat that he had clearly purchased for the occasion and was not entirely comfortable in. Nathan had written to Missouri and received back a letter from a sister he had not spoken to in 4 years, who came out on the train from Kansas City and stood in the church pew with tears running down her face and an expression of profound relief. Ruth wore a dress she had ordered from a catalog in Cheyenne, blue as the Wyoming sky on a clear day, with white at the collar, and she stood at the altar with Nathan and spoke her vows with the directness that was simply who she was, clearly and without trembling, looking at him the entire time. He spoke his with the same quiet seriousness with which he did everything that mattered to him, and she felt each word land with the weight he intended, deliberate and certain, not performance but commitment. When the Reverend finished, Nathan kissed her, and the small congregation made a sound of approval that was warm and genuine, and Garrett Doyle's eldest son let out a whoop that echoed off the church ceiling and made everyone laugh. They held the celebration at the ranch, because the ranch was theirs, and because Ruth had decided it was appropriate to celebrate where they were choosing to make their life. Doyle brought food and a fiddle player. The evening was long and warm and full of the specific happiness of a community gathered around two people who had earned each other through something real and difficult. Cass, who was a quietly emotional man behind his taciturn exterior, found Nathan at some point in the evening and shook his hand for a long time, and said something to him in a low voice that Nathan nodded at and that Ruth did not hear, but that Cass told her later had been simply, "Gerald would have liked you. He would have been glad for her." And Nathan had said, "I know, I intend to be worthy of it." The summer of 1879 was the hardest and best work of Ruth's life. They ran the Hawkins ranch together, which was now formally the Keating property as well, the deed amended to reflect the marriage. And they ran it not as two people dividing tasks, but as two people building something together, which was different in quality and in satisfaction. Nathan had a rancher's instincts that had been in him longer than he had used them, and they emerged now with the naturalness of something returning to its native element. He was methodical and patient with the cattle and the land, and he was willing to be wrong and to learn, which were qualities she valued enormously. She taught him to make her grandmother's cornbread. He taught her to read land, the specific way that ground tells you things about water and weather, and what will grow and what will not, knowledge that he had accumulated over years of moving across it. They argued about the best place to sink a new well and spent 2 weeks on it before discovering that they had both been wrong and the right place was somewhere neither of them had suggested, which they agreed was actually the best possible outcome because it meant they had both been engaged genuinely rather than one of them simply deferring. Nathan wrote to the attorney in Laramie and to Marshall Cutter and closed out his involvement in the Voss case with the final documentation required. He did it with a thoroughness that left nothing unresolved, every legal thread tied, every witness account filed, every piece of the evidentiary chain complete and accessible for the federal record. When it was done, he sat at the kitchen table on the evening of the day the last letter went out and was quiet for a long time. "What are you thinking?" Ruth asked. "That it is finished," he said. 3 years of carrying it, it is finished." "How does that feel?" He thought about it genuinely. "Lighter," he said. "And strange, I have been so accustomed to the weight that I notice its absence." "That will pass," she said, "and in its place you will get used to something else." "What else?" She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the way he had covered her hands that first evening, and she said, "This." In September, Ruth told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, the same table that had been the site of so many important conversations between them. She told him directly, without preamble, because that was how she was, and she watched his face do something she had only seen it do a handful of times, a slow, full opening, all the contained gravity giving way to something unmistakable and radiant. He said nothing for a moment. His jaw worked slightly, which was the Nathan version of emotional overwhelm. Then he came around the table and sat beside her and took both her hands and held them with great care, and he looked at her with an expression that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life as the image of what happiness actually looked like on the face of the man she loved. "Are you all right?" he said. "How are you feeling? Do you need—" "I am very well," she said, laughing. I am healthy and strong, and I have been through considerably more difficult things than a pregnancy." "You have," he said, and squeezed her hands. "You absolutely have. We will need to add to the house," she said practically. "The east room could be expanded. I will start on the plans tomorrow," he said. "And we will need to discuss, Ruth," he said gently. "Can we discuss the practical things in an hour? Just for an hour can we sit here?" She looked at him. His eyes were very bright. She felt a wave of love so strong it was almost vertiginous. "Yes," she said. "We can sit here." They sat there, his hands over hers, in the morning light of the Wyoming September, and did not need to say anything at all. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a building time, literally and otherwise. Nathan expanded the east side of the house with lumber from the mill in Millhaven, working on it himself on days when the weather permitted and learning, as he went with a stubbornness about self-sufficiency that she found both exasperating and deeply endearing. By the time the cold became serious, the east room was enclosed, rough but solid, and she had put up curtains on the single window and a small iron stove in the corner and pronounced it ready. Garrett Doyle came to visit in January, bringing his wife Marie, a formidable Medes woman who assessed Ruth with a direct intelligence and then declared her very sensible, which Ruth gathered was a high compliment. Marie knew midwifery. They had a long conversation about what to expect in the spring, and Ruth left it feeling more prepared and also genuinely fond of Marie Doyle, who had a wit as dry and incisive as anyone she had met. On the 3rd of March, 1880, their son was born. Ruth's labor was long, 17 hours, but she was strong and stubborn in precisely the way that made Marie Doyle say afterward that she had rarely assisted a more determined woman, and Nathan was there through all of it in a way that was not typical for the era, but that Ruth had made clear was non-negotiable. He sat where she could reach him, and she reached for him when she needed to, and he did not flinch or look away. And he held her hand through the hardest hours with the steady presence that was simply who he was. When the child came, it was a boy, 7 pounds and angry about it, with a set of lungs that made his presence in the house indistinguishable for the first several minutes. Nathan held him with the careful, slightly stunned quality of a man encountering something that has exceeded his capacity to prepare for, and he looked at Ruth over the child's head with an expression that she thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Hello," Nathan said to the baby very quietly. The baby continued to register his complaints with the world. "Yes," Nathan said. "I understand. It is a lot to take in all at once." Ruth laughed, and it hurt, and she did not care. They named him James Gerald Keating. James for Nathan's father, with whom his relationship had been complicated but whose name he had decided to reclaim with a different association. Gerald for the man whose land had given Ruth her beginning in Wyoming, and whose death she still felt with a specific, honest sadness, because she had never met him, and he had made the small kindness of keeping his letters honest. James Gerald Keating proved to be a child of considerable opinions and high volume who gradually, over the first year of his life, emerged as a person of considerable charm and a direct gaze that was unmistakably his mother's, and a tendency to quiet observation that was unmistakably his father's. Nathan took to fatherhood with the same methodical seriousness he brought to everything that mattered, and also with a tenderness that Ruth found consistently affecting. He read to James every evening from before James could possibly understand it, because he maintained that the habit was worth establishing early, and also, she suspected, because he simply liked doing it. He taught him the names of things outdoors the moment James could walk, cattle and birds and plants and clouds and stars, with the patient, observational language of a man who had learned to read the world and wanted to pass that reading on. The ranch grew in the early 1880s as the Wyoming Territory continued its transformation. They added cattle and expanded the grazing operation. Nathan built a second barn with proper help hired from Millhaven, a project that took a summer, and that he managed with the specific combination of clear expectations and genuine respect for the men working that made people want to do good work for him. The land office business was fully settled, and the Keating property was registered clearly and without challenge, the Voss affair having apparently functioned as a sufficiently dramatic demonstration of the federal willingness to intervene in land fraud that several similar operations in the territory became considerably more cautious. Cass stayed on. He was, Ruth thought, one of the genuinely good things Gerald Hawkins had left behind, this quiet, loyal man who simply appeared every morning and did his work, and cared about the property with a steady devotion that was its own kind of love for a place. He became an uncle figure to James, teaching him to ride before Ruth was entirely ready for James to be on a horse, which led to a specific conversation between Ruth and Cass that Cass received with great seriousness, and Nathan refused to mediate, saying that this was a negotiation between two people he respected equally, and he was staying out of it. In the spring of 1882, Ruth told Nathan she was expecting again. This time she told him in the barn, because that was where she found him when she had finished her own mental accounting of the situation and decided it was time to share it. He was checking a fence post and he turned when she came in and read her face before she said anything, because he had gotten very good at reading her, which she thought was one of the genuine pleasures of being loved by someone who paid attention. "Again," she said. He set down the fence post and crossed the barn to her and kissed her briefly and with great warmth. "When," he said, "autumn, I believe. Marie Doyle should know. I will write to her. Are you well?" "Very well." He held her face in both hands and looked at her with that full, open expression that still had the same effect on her that it had had in the kitchen 2 years ago when he had told her he loved her for the first time, which was to say a powerful and somewhat undignified effect that she was entirely uninterested in minimizing. "I am very glad," he said, "that you did not stay in Ohio." She laughed. "I am very glad that your horse threw a shoe. It was a very inconveniently timed horseshoe." "The best kind," she said. Their daughter was born in October of 1882, small and determined, and from the first hours possessed of a quality of focused calm that made Marie Doyle say she had the old eyes, meaning the eyes that saw more than they should. They named her Eliza, after Ruth's mother, who had died 3 years before Ruth came west, and whose memory Ruth carried with the specific warmth of a love that had been uncomplicated and consistent. Eliza grew up with James, 2 years her senior, with a dynamic between them that was loving and argumentative in equal measure, and that Nathan watched with a satisfaction he expressed by saying, on one particularly lively evening when both children were arguing about the ownership of a particular carved wooden horse, that he supposed this was what he had been working toward. "An argument over a toy," Ruth said. "A family," he said. "This exact family." She looked at him across the table, over the heads of their arguing children, and felt the full weight of the life they had built together, its difficulty and its beauty and its ongoing dailiness, which was itself a kind of miracle, the fact of choosing each other every day in every small action, in the coffee made and the fence repaired and the book read aloud and the hand reached for in the dark. "Yes," she said, "this is what we were working toward." In 1883, Nathan received a letter from a man in Denver who had read the public record of the Voss case and who worked with a newly organized organization focused on land rights and legal protection for small property owners in the Western Territories. The man wanted to know if Nathan would consult on a similar case in Colorado, a situation where a large ranching operation was using organized fraud and intimidation against smaller homesteaders. Nathan brought the letter to Ruth. She read it and then looked at him. "What do you want to do?" "I would go to Denver," he said, "for 2 weeks, perhaps 3, long enough to evaluate the documentation and give them what direction I can." "You resolve it in 3 weeks." "No," he said, "but I can point them toward resolution." "Then go," Ruth said. "Cass is here. Doyle's son has offered to help with the fall work. James is 5 and Eliza is not yet 1, which means I am capable of managing what needs managing. "I know you are capable," he said. "That has never been the question." "Then what is the question?" He was quiet for a moment. "Whether I want to leave," he said. She understood. The ranch was not a confinement to him. The life was not something he had settled for. He had chosen it with his whole self, and the choosing was ongoing and genuine. The difficulty of leaving was not about obligation, but about the fact that what was here, what was in this kitchen and in the next room where James was sleeping and in the cradle where Eliza made the small sounds of infant contentment, was genuinely where he wanted to be. "Go," she said. "Come back and bring me something from Denver." "What do you want?" "Something impractical," she said. "I am surrounded by practical things. I want something beautiful." He smiled, that quiet, full smile she loved. "I will find you something beautiful." He went to Denver. He came back in 19 days, which was 3 days shorter than he had estimated, carrying documentation that helped the Colorado case move forward and a length of ribbon silk in a deep red that was, he said, the most beautiful thing he had found in Denver, and that he suspected she would make into something practical anyway. She laughed, and she did. She made it into a sash that she wore on the occasion of James's first day of school in the fall of 1884, when Millhaven had finally organized a proper schoolhouse with a teacher brought from the East, a young woman of considerable nerve named Miss Cooper, who arrived expecting the frontier to be a temporary adventure and stayed because she fell in love with Millhaven itself, which Ruth understood completely. James was 6 that September and took to school with the same focused interest he took to everything Nathan taught him outside, which was to say with complete seriousness, and a tendency to ask questions until he understood something thoroughly. His teacher sent home a note in the second week saying that James Keating was the most question-asking student she had encountered in 4 years of teaching, and that she meant this as a compliment. Nathan read this note twice. "He gets it from his mother," he said. "He absolutely gets it from you," Ruth said. They looked at each other and agreed that James got it from both of them, which was the truth, and which pleased them in the uncomplicated way that the recognition of a child's inheritance pleases parents who love each other. Eliza walked at 10 months, which was early, and talked at 13 months, which was also early, and had strong opinions about both by the time she was 2. Opinions that she communicated with a directness that was exactly her mother's and a vocabulary that Nathan expanded with the deliberate intention of giving her as many words as possible to work with, on the theory that a girl in this territory was going to need language as a tool, and he intended to make sure she had access to the full set. The winters in Wyoming in the 1880s were significant and various. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was catastrophically cold across the northern plains, the terrible die-up that killed vast numbers of cattle across Montana and Wyoming and broke the big cattle operations that had overextended, the open-range bonanza that had driven so many investors east ending in frozen catastrophe. The Keating Ranch lost cattle too, 30 head in the worst weeks, a loss that hurt. But Nathan had been conservative in his expansion, keeping the operation at a scale they could manage, and the pastures they had fenced carefully held what remained, and they came through it diminished but intact. It was in the aftermath of that winter that they had their one serious, sustained argument about the question of whether to sell a portion of the land to recover the cash position. Nathan thought they should. Ruth thought they should not. The argument lasted 3 days and covered ground that went beyond the specific question of acreage into deeper territory about their approaches to risk and security, and what the ranch meant to each of them. And by the end of the 3 days, they had not fully resolved the original question, but had learned things about each other that were valuable, and had arrived at a compromise position that neither of them had originally considered, which was to lease the north pasture rather than sell it, generating income without permanently reducing the property. This was one of the things she valued most about loving Nathan Keating, she reflected in the quiet afterward. He argued honestly. He did not perform agreement. When he disagreed, he said so, clearly and with his reasoning, and he listened to her reasoning with genuine attention, and could change his position when the argument was good enough. This was rarer than it should have been, in men she had known, and she did not take it for granted. The territory became the state of Wyoming in 1890, and Wyoming, famously, had included women's suffrage in its constitution since its first territorial government in 1869. Ruth had voted in territorial elections for over a decade by this point, which was not something she had grown up expecting to do, and which she considered seriously each time as a right that had been granted here, on this frontier, by men who had taken a practical view of the women around them, and which she understood was not yet universal and might not be for a long time. She talked to Eliza about this, when Eliza was 8 and beginning to understand what it meant. She talked to James about it too, because Nathan agreed with her that the understanding should not be limited to their daughter. The injustice, Ruth told both of her children, is not that some people have fewer rights. The injustice is that we accept it as natural. Rights are not natural. They are fought for, and they can be taken back if we stop paying attention. James, at 10, considered this with the focused seriousness he brought to his father's lessons. Eliza, at 8, said, "I'm going to vote when I am old enough." "Yes," Ruth said, "you are." Nathan, across the kitchen table, said nothing, but the expression on his face was the one she loved best, the full, open one that said he was exactly where he wanted to be. In 1891, they had a third child, another boy, born in June and named Thomas, which was a name they had not planned in advance, but that appeared to them both as right when they saw him. A quiet baby who grew into a thoughtful, gentle boy with Nathan's patience and Ruth's stubbornness, and his own particular quality of calm that seemed native to him rather than learned. James, at 11, was learning to manage the cattle operation, with an engagement that suggested he would be a rancher of his own someday. Eliza, at 9, was learning everything that was offered to her with an appetite that her teacher, who was by this point a second teacher, Miss Cooper, having married and moved to Cheyenne, found remarkable. Thomas arrived into a family that was already a complete world, and he inhabited it with the ease of someone who had always belonged there. Garrett Doyle died in 1892 in his 70s, having lived a full and considerable life. Nathan rode out to Casper Creek for the funeral, and stayed 3 days, helping Marie and the family with the practical matters that follow a death. Ruth could not go, Thomas being only a year old and James having a fever that week, but she wrote to Marie a long letter that tried to say honestly what Doyle's presence had meant, the 4 men who had ridden south with him on that November morning in 1878, and what that riding had made possible. Marie wrote back, a letter of 2 pages in her strong, direct hand, which ended with, "He thought very highly of both of you. He told me once that Nathan Keating was the kind of man who did the right thing when it cost something, and that Mrs. Keating was the kind of woman who understood that the right thing always costs something. He said those 2 things belonged together." Ruth read this to Nathan at the kitchen table. He was quiet for a long time. "He was right," Nathan said finally. "He was," Ruth agreed. Cass retired in 1893 after 15 years of faithful service to the Hawkins and then the Keating Ranch. He was not old, but he had saved enough, and he had a sister in Nebraska he wanted to visit. They held a dinner for him, the full family, and James gave a short speech that was unexpectedly eloquent for a 13-year-old, and that made Cass take his hat off and hold it against his chest in the manner of a man being deeply moved. Nathan shook his hand for a long time, and Ruth hugged him, which he accepted with the flustered grace of a private man being publicly cared for. "You built this place," Cass told them, looking around the yard. "Gerald started it, but you 2 built it into what it is." The ranch in the 1890s was not what it had been in 1878. The house had been expanded twice, the East Room, and then a second addition to the north that gave James and Thomas each their own space, and provided Eliza with a room that she had decorated with the specificity of a girl who knew exactly what she wanted. The barn was new, replaced in 1889 with a proper structure that Nathan had overseen with the pride of a man who has built something intended to last. The cattle operation was established and respected, the Keating name in the county carrying a weight that came from years of honest dealing and willingness to work. On an evening in October of 1895, which was 17 years after Nathan had led a lame horse into her yard on foot in the dusk, Ruth sat on the expanded porch with Nathan beside her, and the Wyoming sky doing what it did in October, which was to put on a display of color above the mountains that made everything below it feel small and fortunate. James was inside with a letter from a school in Laramie that he was considering. Eliza was reading with the focused absorption she brought to books that Nathan had always quietly encouraged. Thomas was somewhere in the yard chasing one of the barn cats with the joyful irresponsibility of a 4-year-old, which was something he would not be for much longer. Nathan had his coffee and she had hers, and the evening was cooling in the specific way Wyoming evenings cool, with a suddenness that is refreshing in July and genuinely cold in October, and she pulled her shawl tighter, and he moved slightly so that his shoulder was against hers, which was his version of offering warmth without making a production of it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet in the comfortable way of someone who is thinking something real. "I was thinking," he said, "about a man who showed up on foot at a gate with a lame horse and no particular prospects, and asked to sleep in a barn. A man of very little conversation," she said. "He was building toward it," Nathan said. "He took his time. He was uncertain how it would be received." She turned and looked at him, this man who was 42 now, with threads of gray at his temples and the weathered exterior of someone who had spent almost 2 decades working outdoor land, and behind the exterior the same quality she had noticed in the lamplight of the barn that first morning when he had come to return her pot and cup, the stillness that was not empty but full, the quietness that was presence rather than absence. "It was received very well," she said. He looked back at her. The sky above the mountains was doing something extraordinary with the last of the light. "Yes," he said, "it was." She leaned into his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat there on the porch of the ranch that had been Gerald Hawkins's tentative beginning and was now fully and completely theirs, in the October evening, with the sound of Thomas catching the barn cat and announcing this achievement loudly, and the lamp in the window where Eliza read, and inside James reading his letter from Laramie, and this quiet man's arm around her. And 17 years of a life that had been hard in every way worth being hard and beautiful, in every way worth being beautiful. Ruth Hawkins Keating thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in Millhaven with $42 and a carpet bag and a stubbornness that people had commented on since she was 7, and she found that she had no complaints about what that woman had decided, not a single one. "Thank you," she said quietly into the evening. Nathan looked at her. "For what?" "For not going to Montana," she said. He made a low sound, not quite a laugh but in the same family. "I never really wanted to go to Montana," he said. "I think I was looking for a reason to stop." "Did you find one?" His arm tightened around her. Outside, Thomas had released the barn cat and was running back toward the porch with the specific energy of a boy approaching supper time. "Yes," Nathan said. "I found one." Thomas arrived on the porch in a rush of small-person energy and climbed into Ruth's lap with the complete confidence of a child who has never been unwelcome in his own family. And she held him and he smelled of hay and outdoor air and something sweetly himself. And Nathan reached over and ruffled Thomas's hair with a gentleness that was everything. And the Wyoming evening deepened around them into the first real dark of the October night. And the stars began to appear, one by one, then all at once. The way they did out here, where there was nothing between you and the sky, which was the thing she had learned to love about this country that she had come to by accident and stayed in by choice. The particular quality of its sky, which offered no shelter and no pretense but only the full and unmediated enormity of the world, and in that enormity the small, irreducible fact of a life that was genuinely, completely, exactly enough. James came out to the porch with his letter and said, "I have decided about Laramie." And Nathan said, "I am going," James said with 17-year-old certainty, "but I am coming back." "Good," Ruth said. "This ranch will need you." "I know," James said, and sat on the porch steps with the easy proprietary comfort of someone who understands that a place belongs to them not through legal document, but through the accumulation of all the days they have lived in it. Eliza appeared in the doorway behind them. "Is there supper soon?" she said. "Soon," Ruth said. "Good," said Eliza, and disappeared back into the lamplight. Thomas had fallen asleep in Ruth's lap with the sudden totality that small children achieve, the instantaneous transition from full activity to complete absence, his weight warm and absolute against her. Nathan looked at him and then at her, and what was in his face was the same thing that had been there in February of 1879 outside the courthouse in Laramie, that full, open, radiant thing, except that it had 17 additional years of daily living behind it now. 17 years of fence lines and coffee cups and arguments and difficult winters and 3 children and the accumulated weight of a life genuinely shared. And it was not smaller for any of that. It was larger. It was the largest, truest thing she had ever been given, and she knew it and she held it with care, the way you hold something irreplaceable, not tightly, because tightness is its own kind of fear, but with attention, with gratitude, with the ongoing, deliberate choice to notice what you have while you have it. "Come inside," Nathan said quietly, when the evening had fully gone to dark. "It is getting cold." She looked at him one more moment, at the stars behind his shoulder and his face in the light from the window. "Yes," Ruth Hawkins Keating said, "let us go inside." And she rose and carried Thomas, and they went in together through the lamplit doorway into the warmth that was theirs, that they had made, that had been made of everything that had cost something and been worth it. And the door closed behind them on the Wyoming night, and the stars over the mountains continued their ancient, indifferent burning, and the Keating ranch held its ground on the earth, solid and real, as it would for a long time to come.